Hello everyone, this is Iran Talk, and in this video I'd like to present the Global 25 results for the Achaemenid, Parthian and Sasanian era Iranians from the northern part of the Iranian plateau. I will also present the autosomal results for contemporary Iranians utilizing these ancient samples alongside the previously sequenced samples we have from northwestern Iran from the sites of Dinka Tepe, Tepe Hasanlu and Haji Firuz Tepe. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin this analysis. The study from which these samples are from was released by Nature Communications on May 13, and it was titled Ancient DNA Indicates 3,000 Years of Genetic Continuity in the Northern Iranian Plateau from the Copper Age to the Sassanid Empire. This was a very groundbreaking study, and what was proven is that there is indeed a great degree of genetic stability in the Iranian plateau since the ancient time, dating as far back as the Achaemenid period. Here is a map of the sites from which these samples were taken from, as well as the sites for which previous studies also took samples from. This is, of course, a map of the Iranian plateau. The Achaemenid era samples were taken from Mersinshal, the Parthian period samples were taken from Lyre Song Ban, and finally the Sasanian period samples were taken from Vestamin. And these sampled sites are from the Caspian region in northern Iran, and at the very end of the video you will see why this is a very important detail. I also wanted to mention that a Chalcolithic era sample was sequenced from Golafshan Tepe, and there was another that was taken from Kalmakari cave, and this sample dated to the medieval period. A final point I wanted to mention is that the sites of Dinka Tepe, Haji Firuz and Tepe Hasanlu are located on this map as well in the northwest in the Kurdistan region, as are the sites for which previous samples were sequenced from the Mesolithic through the Copper Age, and you can see them here as well. And it's also important to note that the sites that I have previously covered here on my channel are also depicted on the map, so you can just take a look at the map to get a good idea of all sampled sites across Iran as mentioned. That is it for my introduction. Now I'd like to get into the genetic analysis utilizing Davidsky's Global 25 calculator. To begin, here are the source populations I will be using for an ancient breakdown of these samples, and this is a prehistoric breakdown. As you can see, most of the populations are from the Neolithic, though there is one component from the Bronze Age, which is the Yamnayan component. Here are the Neolithic results for these samples, and you can see that there are on average 53.8% Iran Ganjdara Neolithic, 22.5% Anatolian farmer from the late Neolithic, 15.3% Caucasian hunter-gatherer from Kotyaz in Georgia, 5.3% Yamnayan from Russia from the side of Samara, and finally 3.1% Natufian. Now, what's evident from these results is that on a genetic level, the Neolithic ancestry from Ganjdara dominates all the way from the Chalcolithic up through the medieval period. Nonetheless, you can also see Anatolian farmer ancestry, Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry, a bit of steppe or Indo-European ancestry, and finally Natufian ancestry. There is also no India Mesolithic or East Asian ancestry, and all of these components are West Eurasian in origin. And this is in contrast to the original findings of the study, which did find some sort of Andamanese hunter-gatherer as well as East Eurasian ancestry in some of the samples, but here you can see there is none. Also, it's worth mentioning that the Yamnayan or Indo-European ancestry is very minimal. The sample size is pretty small, and that's represented by the n equals, with the most samples being found in the Lyre Song Ban sample set and the least being found in the Golafshan Chalcolithic sample set, the Sasanian era Vestamin sample set, and finally the Kalmakari cave sample set. Here are the Neolithic results for the individual samples, and you can see that there are on average 51% Iranian farmer, 22% Anatolian farmer, 18.9% Caucasian hunter-gatherer, 4.9% Yamnayan, 2.9% Natufian, 0.3% India Mesolithic, and 0.1% Siberian. Thus, once again, when taking a look at the Neolithic results, you can see that the Ganjdara Neolithic or Iranian farmer component dominates, and this is very interesting, and this suggests an autochthonous origin point for the ancient Iranians, as their Yamnayan ancestry is very minimal, with the peak being around 8.6% during the Sasanian period. Moving on, I'd like to get into a more historical genetic analysis, and here are the source populations I will be using, as there's a Copper Age Sagabi source from Iran, there's a late Copper Age, early Bronze Age Shah Tepe source, there's a BMAC source from Goner, there's an Iron Age source from Hassanlu, there's a early Iranian Yaz source from Turkmenistan from Takirbay, there's a Pekin Chalcolithic Israel source, and finally there's an early Bronze Age Shakri Sokta source with a South Asian profile or Indus Valley civilization profile. Here are the results utilizing this calculator, and you can see that the largest component at 30.3% is the Shah Tepe Bronze Age component, and this is actually a component originating in northeastern Iran in the region of Hyrcania. Then you can see 22.8% Sagabi Chalcolithic ancestry, 20.8% Hassanlu ancestry, 17.0% BMAC or Goner ancestry, 4.7% Israel Chalcolithic Pekin ancestry, and finally 4.4% ancestry from an early Iranian Yaz source. Thus, the historical results for these samples again suggests mostly an autochthonous Iranian ancestral origin point, and this is very interesting. And what this means is that even during the ancient period, the Iranians were not some sort of European or Nordic population, but rather they were an indigenous population. This is further evident from the results for the individual samples, which are 39.4% Shah Tepe Bronze Age, 29.2% Sagabi Chalcolithic, 13.1% Hassanlu Iron Age, 11.4% BMAC Goner Bronze Age, 4.0% early Iranian from Turkmenistan from the Yaz culture, 2.0% Pekin Chalcolithic, and finally 0.9% ancestry derived from the Indus Valley civilization. Thus, once again, you can see that the autochthonous ancestral origin point for the ancient Iranians is evident. Now I'd like to present the distances for these samples, beginning with the Achaemenid era sample set from Mersinshall. Only the distances for the averages will be presented and not the individual samples. As you can see, the Achaemenid era sample set is closest to the Shah Tepe samples, followed by BMAC and early Bronze Age Iranian sample sets. And then you can see other BMAC populations as well as Chalcolithic Iranian populations with also similarity to the Hassanlu late Bronze Age samples. And this is very interesting. And what this suggests is that the Achaemenid era Iranians were primarily, as mentioned and discussed before, of indigenous descent. Here are the distances for the Lyre Song Bond Parthian sample set, and yet again the Shah Tepe sample set is the closest, followed by Iranian populations from the early Bronze Age, the Copper Age, and then you can also see a bit of BMAC populations here as well. But what's interesting is that this sample set also matches with samples from as far as Mongolia from the Iron Age with an Iranian plateau profile, and this means that this sort of ancestry was very widespread and was not only restricted to Iran. Nonetheless, it also shows that wherever Iranians went, they maintained their genetic profile. Here are the distances for the Sassanid era sample, and once again the Shah Tepe sample set is the closest, followed by BMAC populations from Iran as well, all the way back since the Chalcolithic. And what's interesting here is that Iranian plateau profile samples also appear, suggesting a great degree of genetic continuity. And this is because even for samples that are found outside of Iran all the way back to the Iron Age, they nonetheless possess a profile very similar to this sample, and this means that from the Achaemenid period up through the Sassanid period, the Iranians maintained a great degree of genetic continuity. Here is the last of the ancient distances chart, and you can see that this is for the medieval era Kalmakari sample, and the closest again are Iranian populations, but this one is a bit distinct with no BMAC populations appearing here, and the majority of the populations are northwestern Iranian samples, followed by Mesopotamian and Armenian samples with a similar profile, and this is very interesting. I reckon that because this was a Western Iranian sample, the profile was closer to the northwestern Iranians from the Iron Age as opposed to the northern Iranians from the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian periods, and this is primarily because of regional variation within the Iranian plateau, and I'm of course referring to genetic variants. That is it for my analysis of the ancient Iranian samples. Up next, I will be taking a look at how much of the ancestry of modern day Iranians is derived from the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian era Iranian samples I took a look at here. Here are the source populations that I will be utilizing, and you can see that there is a pre-Islamic Iranian component made up of the three Iron Age Iranian samples from northwestern Iran from the sites of Dinka, Tepe, Haji Firuz, and Tepe Hasanlu, and then you have the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian era samples followed by a Bronze Age Caucasian source, a Phoenician source, a classical Hellenic source, a late antique Arab source, a South Asian Bronze Age source from the Indus Valley, and then a medieval Turkic source, a modern Caucasian source, and finally a sub-Saharan African Bantu source. To begin, here are the results for the Iranian Zoroastrians, and there are 30 samples in this dataset, and there are on average 87% pre-Islamic Iranian, 7% classical Hellenic, 4.2% South Asian, and 1.8% medieval Turkic. Thus, these results prove that the Iranian Zoroastrians are largely genetically contiguous. Moving on, here are the results for nearly all Iranian Persian groups, and you can see they're on average 79.5% pre-Islamic Iranian, 6.4% Indus Valley Bronze Age, 6.1% classical Hellenic, 5.1% medieval Turkic, 1.1% modern Caucasian, 0.8% late antique Arab, so minimal Arab ancestry, 0.5% Bronze Age Caucasian, and 0.5% sub-Saharan African. The pre-Islamic Iranian component peaks in the Akhomids, also known as the Laristanis, at 90.6%, though nonetheless it's higher than 80% in the majority of these sample sets, and the lowest it is at is 62.6% in the Persians from Semnan, and this is very interesting. Thus, aside from the Persians from Semnan, all other Iranian Persian populations have genetic continuity greater than 70% and 80% in the majority of these samples as mentioned. Here are the results for the non-Persian Iranic populations residing in Iran, and you can see that they're on average 84.8% pre-Islamic Iranian, 4.8% classical Hellenic, 2.8% medieval Turkic, 2.7% Phoenician, 2.4% Bronze Age Caucasian, 2.4% Indus Valley Bronze Age, and 0.0% Sub-Saharan African. The populations broken down here are the Gilakis, the Mazandaranis, the Laks, the Lurs, as well as the Tats, and they seem to have more genetic continuity than the Persians of today. Now here are the results for the Iranian Kurds, and they're on average 75.5% pre-Islamic Iranian, 11.1% classical Hellenic, 3.8% medieval Turkic, 3.4% late antique Arab, 2.8% South Asian or Indus Valley derived, 2.4% Bronze Age Caucasian, 0.6% modern Caucasian, and 0.3% Sub-Saharan African. The Kurds tend to have less genetic continuity than most average Iranians. Nonetheless, their continuity exceeds 70%, and this is very interesting, and this shows that the Kurds are largely genetically an Iranian population. Up next, we have the results for the Yarsanis from Iran, and this is actually a religious community, and they're on average 64% pre-Islamic Iranian, 28.8% Bronze Age Caucasian, 4.0% medieval Turkic, 1.8% late antique Arab, 0.8% South Asian, and 0.6% Sub-Saharan African. The Yarsanis are also primarily derived from pre-Islamic Iranian populations. Nonetheless, they have significant Bronze Age Caucasian ancestry, though minimal foreign ancestry. The last population I will be taking a look at here are the Iranian Jews, and you can see that they're on average 56.6% pre-Islamic Iranian, 39% Phoenician, 3.8% late antique Arab, and 0.6% Indus Valley Bronze Age. What seems to be the case here is that the Iranian Jews have significant Levantine ancestry. Nonetheless, they have around 57% pre-Islamic Iranian ancestry and overall are largely an Iranian population genetically. Before I get into my concluding results, I just like to present the distances for the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian era samples with the modern Iranian populations in mind. Once again, I'd like to begin with the Achaemenid era Mersanshal sample. Then you can see that the closest populations are the Mazandaranis and the Gilakis, followed by the Persians from Sistan, the Laks from Iran, as well as the Persians from Fars. And after that, you have the Zoroastrian Iranis from India, and then other Kurdish, Persian, and Yazidi populations, and also the Tats of Iran. And this is very interesting, and this suggests that the ancient Achaemenid population, while a bit distinct from modern Iranians, nonetheless is closest to them in terms of comparison to other populations. Moving on, here are the distances for the Parthian era lyre song bond sample. Then the closest populations are the Mazandaranis and the Gilakis, followed by the Kurds from Urmia, the Tats, the Kurds of Fali descent, and then the Laks, and then you have other Iranian populations. And what this shows is that the closest modern populations to the Parthian era Iranian samples are the modern day Iranians. Up next are the distances for the Sassanid era sample from Vestamine. As you can see, the closest populations here are the Mazandaranis and the Gilakis, yet again followed by the Kurdish sample from Urmia, and then you have Persian, Kurdish, and Zoroastrian populations, as well as the Lurs and the Tats. And this is very interesting, and once again you can see that this suggests a great degree of genetic continuity with modern Iranians, though nonetheless still a bit distinct. And also the Tailish make this list, which suggests that they're also largely of Iranian genetic origin. The last sample for which I will be presenting modern day distances is the medieval era Kalmakari cave sample. As you can see, nearly all of the populations closest to this sample are the Kurds, with the only exceptions being the Lurs as well as the Yazidis from Armenia, though nonetheless the Yazidis can also be considered to be Kurdish, so the Lurs are the only Iranian population that make this list that are not of Kurdish origin. Thus, these results suggest that the medieval era sample that was sequenced was likely a Kurd. Now, before I conclude, I'd just like to revisit the claims made by Jason Reza Jorjani in the past regarding the origins of the modern day Iranians, particularly the Persians of today. And these anti-Persian views were presented by Jorjani in his 2016 article Against Perennial Philosophy for the Alt-Right.com. For those of you who don't know, the Alt-Right.com was co-founded by Jason Reza Jorjani and was an alt-right platform. Here is an important snippet from this article, and you can see Jorjani claimed that prior to the Arab, Turkic, and Mongol conquests of Iran, in other words, up to the end of the Sassanid period, the majority of Iranians were genetically identical to Europeans. And then he mentions that this is why Iran never produced a Hegel after the Arab invasion. Jason then mentions that the Arab and Turco-Mongol invasion led to a demographic shift in Iran, which deprived Iran of the genetic basis for the production of a Hegel, Nietzsche, or Heidegger, and this is why Iranians need to be genetically re-engineered. I have now utilized the latest available genetic evidence to refute these ludicrous claims made by Jason Reza Jorjani. This was not the only example of Jorjani's lunacy, as in a 2018 comment in response to a friend of mine, he wrote that Iran was an Aryan idea and not a group of people, and if you want to learn more about the genetics of the people who came to be associated with the idea, you have to take samples from around the Caspian Sea. And now that we have these samples from the northern part of Iran, very close to the Caspian Sea, and also this region did not really experience much Turkic invasions, as Jorjani alluded to, then you can say that the claims made by Jorjani here have been refuted. And also that even though Jorjani is saying that the Aryans only interbred with the local population in very small numbers, this suggests that this is not the case. And ironically, Jorjani tries to say that around 10% were the ones who achieved this ancient civilization and 90% who did little to contribute to Iran. And this is not his actual belief, as he said that he does not believe this, and he believes that nearly all of the ancient Iranian population was genetically Nordic European. However, this view has now been refuted. This view came from a cock whose fiancée has many interesting past romances. And this fact is evident from this collage of images of Nasim Nouri's lovers. In fact, Jason isn't even Iranian himself, as his mongrelized father, Ferdun Qajar Jorjani, is of Azerbaijani extraction, and you can see very Semitic features in this image as well as pseudo-Mongoloid features. Ferdun is known to be a womanizer as the image suggests, and he also was very abusive towards Jorjani during his youth. Nonetheless, this does not give Jason any right to spread nonsensical information about the genetic origins of modern day Iranians. What's more is that despite being very racist, especially towards Iranians, Jorjani had an African American as his heir for his Prometheist movement, which is just a Satanist movement, and for all these reasons, he should not be trusted moving forward. To conclude, in this analysis, I provided the genetic results utilizing the Global 25 calculator for the ancient Iranian Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian era samples from the sites of Mersin Shah, Lyre Song, Ban, and West Amin. What was proven is that these ancient Iranians were primarily of indigenous or autochthonous descent and had very little non-West Eurasian ancestry. And in terms of modern Iranians, I proved that the majority of the Iranian population today has around 80% genetic continuity back to this ancient historic population, as well as even before that, since the Iron Age. A final point I'd like to emphasize is that Jorjani has now been thoroughly refuted by the latest available genetic evidence and should no longer spread his ludicrous genetic theories. That is it for this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.